The Valthari Forge Academy was not a welcoming place, and it was never meant to be. It hung in the gravitational shadow of a gas giant called Velthoris, built from dark iron alloy and ancient stone hauled from a dozen different worlds, its towers rising sharp and cold against the stars like the teeth of something enormous and very old. The forges inside never went cold. They burned through every hour of every cycle, and the heat and the smell of hot metal drifted through every corridor and every room like something alive. Students who had been there for years stopped noticing the smell. New students noticed it immediately and then slowly forgot to notice it. And the way you forget the sound of a machine that never stops, Mara Voss arrived on a cargo shuttle that also carried crates of fabrication-grade ore and 3 very large Sketh traders who did not acknowledge her once during the 6-hour journey. She did not mind. She sat near the back with her 2 bags at her feet and a small metal box of personal tools in her lap. And she watched the academy grow larger through the viewport until it filled the whole window. She was 19 years old, not tall, not physically impressive at a glance. She had brown hair pulled back tight, hands that were already rough and scarred from years of working in Europa's deep ice mining tunnels, and dark eyes that moved across things slowly and carefully. The way eyes move when they belong to someone who has learned that looking quickly means missing things Europa had been her whole world for most of her life. A cold, pressurized colony built under kilometers of ice, where the people worked hard and spoke plainly and fixed things themselves when things broke, which was often. It was not a bad place to grow up, but it was not a place that prepared you for much beyond itself, and Mara had always known. Even as a small child watching ore freighters lift off through the ice-ceiling viewports, that she wanted to go beyond the Academy's acceptance letter had arrived 8 months before her departure. Her mother had read it 3 times before she believed it. Her father had said nothing for a long moment, and then said, "Good," in a voice that meant something much larger than the word. Mara had started packing the next morning at the registration gate. A tall, gray-skinned Valthari attendant, with pale gold eyes and fingers that were slightly too long, looked at her documents, looked at her face, and then looked at the documents again. "Human?" the attendant said. "Yes," Mara answered. The attendant handed her a room key and a facility map without another word, and moved on to the next student in the line. Her room was small and the walls were metal, and the bed was built for a slightly taller body. She adjusted the arrangement and set her toolbox on the desk, put her bags in the corner, and sat for exactly 1 minute before she stood up and went to find the classroom. The Advanced Weapons Fabrication course occupied a long room on the 3rd level of the Academy's eastern wing. The walls were lined with forge stations, each equipped with a full heating array and a material workbench. Heavy central tables ran the length of the room. The ceiling was high and vented. And at the front of the room, raised on a low platform so that every student had to look slightly upward, stood Master Kreth Aun. He was 63 standard years old, which for a Valthari was somewhere between mature and ancient, and he looked every year of it in the best possible way. Not frail, but dense, the way old stone is dense. His arms were long, his shoulders broad, and his movements were slow and deliberate and completely without waste. His eyes were deep gold, yet the color of something that had been burning for a very long time. And along his left forearm, barely visible beneath the cuff of his instructor's robe, ran a scar 3 centimeters wide with irregular edges that did not look like a weapon wound and did not look like an accident. He looked at Mara when she walked in, not with anger, not with visible contempt, just with a long, flat look that said he had already placed her in a category, and the category was small. And she should not expect to be moved out of it. Mara found a seat in the middle row, set down her notebook and looked at the room. 12 other students were already seated. A Dothrani girl with 4 arms and copper-colored markings on her neck who was already sketching in a design pad. 2 young Sketh males who moved constantly in their seats, and spoke to each other in clicks. A pale Auran who communicated partially through slow color shifts in her skin, and others Mara had not yet sorted into names. They all noticed her. Some looked curious, some looked blank, and some looked the way people look when they want to make sure you know that you do not quite belong. Creth-Aun began without greeting. He let the room go completely quiet, and then asked, and in a voice that carried easily without being loud, "What is a blade?" The answers came one at a time. The Sketh spoke about tensile strength and mineral hardness and edge retention under impact stress. The Dothrani girl with the copper markings, who Mara would later learn was named Sevi, spoke about the blade as a spiritual extension of the warrior's body, a living piece of family lineage passed forward through time. The Auran shifted 3 careful shades of blue and described the blade in geometric terms as the most efficient solution to the problem of space between 2 bodies in conflict. Each answer was good, detailed, rooted in something long and deep. Creth-Aun acknowledged each one with a slow nod, on the nod of a teacher who is hearing exactly what he expected to hear and is not surprised. Then he looked at Mara. She had not raised her hand. He looked at her anyway. "Human," he said, giving the word a particular flatness. "What is a blade?" Several students turned. The Sketh went quiet. Even the Auran shifted slightly toward attentive. Mara sat up straight and said, in a voice that did not rush and did not apologize, "A blade is a conversation between the maker and whoever the blade is meant for." A short silence. And then a few students laughed. Not with cruelty exactly, but with the easy dismissal of people who heard something simple and decided it was too simple to be serious. Creth-Aun did not laugh. He looked at her with those gold eyes, and something moved very briefly behind them. Not warmth, not approval, something closer to the expression of a person who heard a sound they did not expect in a place they thought they knew completely. Then he turned away and continued with the lecture, as if her answer had never been given. Mara opened her notebook and began to write, not frantically, just steadily. She wrote the date and the room and the instructor's name at the top of the first page. And below that, in small, careful letters, she wrote, "Left forearm, scar. A 3 centimeters wide, irregular border." Find out why she underlined the last 3 words once and kept writing. After the session ended and the room emptied, Sevi walked over to Mara's table, not quickly, not with the warmth of someone who had decided to be friendly, more slowly, so with the measured approach of someone who was curious and wanted a closer look. "That was a strange answer," Sevi said. "It was an accurate one," Mara said. Sevi studied her with 4 arms at rest. "Creth-Aun has been teaching here for 60 years. He trained warriors who fought in the Outer Reaches campaigns. He thinks humans are—" She paused, as if choosing between several available words, unfinished. "I know," Mara said. "Does that bother you?" Sevi asked. Mara picked up her notebook and said without any particular emotion, "Ask me again in a few months," and walked out. That night, Mara sat in the Academy Forge library for 5 hours. She worked through the Vaelthari blade records first, reading 4,000 years of documented technique. Then the Dothrani ceremonial traditions, the Sketh military fabrication histories, the Auran geometric methodology, and when she had finished all of that, she opened the human archives, not the modern ones, not the colony-era fabrication guides, the old ones, the ancient ones. Damascus steel from a region of old Earth called Syria, folded until the metal developed a flowing pattern, Japanese tamahagane, smelted in a clay furnace over 3 full days and sorted by hand, Wootz crucible steel. A technique so refined that the people who first made it had not fully understood what they were doing, only that it worked, and that it worked magnificently. She read about people with no computers and no alloy databases who had learned by burning their hands and starting over. who passed knowledge through demonstration and memory and years of patient repetition, who had made blades that were still sharp 1,000 years after the hands that made them were gone. She filled 4 pages of notes. She looked at what she had written earlier, left forearm, scar, irregular border, and she circled the word irregular. Then she closed the notebook and walked back through the warm metal corridors of the academy toward her room, past forge stations that still glowed faintly in the dark, already thinking about what she was going to build. 3 weeks into the semester, the advanced weapons fabrication class began to find its rhythm. Students worked at their stations every morning, learning the properties of different alloys, practicing edge geometry on practice stock, studying the mechanics of balance and grip. The room was always warm and always loud with the sound of work, and Creth-An moved through it all like a slow current, stopping at each station, watching, correcting, occasionally placing a student's hand in a different position without a single word of explanation, and trusting them to understand why he never stopped at Mara's station. He did not ignore her the way someone ignores a person they are angry at. He ignored her the way someone ignores a piece of furniture that has been placed in a room for reasons they did not agree with and have chosen not to engage with. She was there, she was present, and she did not exist in any way that mattered to him. Mara worked anyway. She was not loud about it. She was not trying to draw attention. She just worked. Carefully and steadily, and she watched everything, and she wrote things in her notebook in the evenings that had nothing to do with her own assignments. She watched how Creth-An moved his hands. The left one was always slightly less extended than the right when he reached for something, which was not a natural asymmetry. It was a learned one, the kind of adjustment a body makes over many years to compensate for something. She noted it without commenting on it to anyone. On the 4th week of the semester, Creth-An stood at the front of the room and announced the defining assignment of the course. Every student was to forge a complete blade, start to finish, from raw material to finished weapon. The blade would be judged on material selection, technique and construction quality, balance and edge geometry, and above all, purpose. The blade had to be suited to the student's own species, their own physiology, their own tradition. It had to be made for a real warrior, which meant it had to understand what a real warrior needed. He gave them 6 weeks. The class received this with visible excitement. Sevi immediately began sketching. The sketh started an animated clicking conversation. The Orin began shifting through a series of quiet, focused colors that Mara had come to understand meant deep concentration. Creth-An then asked the class to remain seated for individual consultations. He called each student up one at a time to discuss their material plans and early concepts. He spent several minutes with each one, asking questions, offering guidance, pointing toward resources in the Forge Supply Archive. When he called Mara up last, he did not bring her to the front. He came to her station instead, which meant the conversation was quieter, more private, which Mara recognized as intentional. He placed a fabrication kit on her table, a flat case, sealed and labeled. Inside were pre-cut blade blanks, pre-measured alloy stock, a set of standard grip components, and an instruction guide, everything a person would need to produce a completed blade without forging anything from raw material. A shortcut dressed up as a starting point. "This is a reasonable accommodation," Creth-An said. "But given that human students have not previously participated in this course, the materials are of acceptable quality, you should be able to produce something adequate." Mara looked at the case. She looked at the word adequate sitting in the air between them. She looked at Creth-An's face, which was entirely still and entirely certain. "Thank you," she said, and she pushed the case back toward him. "I won't need it." Creth-An looked at her for a long moment, not angry, and not surprised, just assessing, the way a person assesses something that has done something unexpected, and they are deciding whether to respond or simply file the information away. Then he picked up the case, tucked it under his arm, Ayman walked away without another word. Mara sat down and opened her notebook. She had 6 weeks. She was going to use all of them. The first 2 weeks were research. Mara went back to everything she had found in the Forge library on her first night and went deeper. She cross-referenced the ancient human folding techniques she had studied with the properties of the alloys available in the Academy's Forge supply archive. She was looking for a specific combination, and something that would use a human method but perform better than the standard materials those methods had been developed for. She found it on the 8th day, a high-carbon Vialthari alloy called Veth iron that had been used for structural components for 3 centuries, but had never been applied to blade construction because it was considered too brittle at standard forge temperatures. Mara read the full material profile and understood immediately that the brittleness was a temperature problem, not a material problem, and that a modified folding process could redistribute the carbon structure in a way that solved it. She spent 2 full days petitioning the supply master, a stout Dothrani named Gen, who had been running the Academy's material stores for 40 years, and approached every non-standard request with the same expression of patient. With immovable doubt, she brought him 3 pages of written calculations and sat across from him at his desk and walked through every number. Gen read the pages slowly, asked 5 questions, received 5 answers he could not immediately argue with, and released the material with the expression of a man who expected to be proven right about his doubts. Eventually, she returned to the forge with the Veth iron and began her tests. The other students noticed that she was doing something different, not because she announced it, but because the color of the metal coming off her forge station was wrong for anything in the standard supply list. Sevi glanced over more than once, though she said nothing. The Sketh students watched briefly and then went back to their own work with the particular focus of people who are trying to appear less interested than they are. Mara ran 7 test folds before she found the temperature window she was looking for. The fold pattern that distributed the carbon correctly, and that produced the edge hardness she needed without the brittleness. On the 7th test piece, she cut the result across a standard reference block, and the edge did not chip or deform. It simply cut. She wrote the temperature and fold count in her notebook and drew a small circle around them during the 3rd week. And she shifted her evening research away from materials and toward people. She pulled every piece of publicly available information on Crethon from the Academy's faculty archive. His teaching record, his competition history, his list of published work on blade theory, 60 years of documented career, thorough and impressive, and almost entirely without personal detail, almost entirely. There was one record, buried in a competition archive from 31 years ago. On a regional blade fighting circuit held on the Vialthari homeworld, Creth-Aun had entered, had won his first 4 bouts, and had been withdrawn from the 5th. The reason given in the record was short and administrative, the kind of language that was written to cover something that was not meant to be examined. But the medical note attached to the withdrawal was still there, not sealed, not removed. Perhaps simply forgotten by whoever had digitized the old records. It described a restraint injury to the left forearm, caused by a grip lock hold applied by an opponent during an attempted disarm. The injury had required reconstruction and had resulted in a permanent reduction in grip strength in the left hand. Mara read it twice. She looked at the words, grip lock hold. She looked at the words, permanent reduction in grip strength. She sat back in her chair and stayed very still for a moment, the way she did when something clicked into place. Then she picked up her pencil and began drawing the first rough shape of a grip. With 2 weeks left before the presentation, Mara began forging in earnest. Not test pieces, not practice runs, but the real blade, the one she had been designing in her notebook for the past month, in small, careful drawings and dense columns of numbers. The blade she was making was a knife, not a sword, not a ceremonial weapon, not the kind of long, impressive thing that announced itself the moment someone carried it into a room. A knife, fixed blade, 22 centimeters of edge, narrow and slightly curved toward the tip, with a spine thick enough to take force and an edge ground to an angle she had calculated precisely. Not the sharpest possible angle, which would be fragile, but the exact angle at which sharpness and durability were in their best possible balance. It looked, at first glance, simple, and she knew it would look simple next to the blades her classmates were producing. Sevi was building a four-bladed ceremonial weapon that required a separate handle for each of her four arms. A genuinely beautiful construction, the Sketh students were forging long, flat war blades with a traditional channel down the center that their species had been making for 6 centuries. The Orin was constructing something geometric and silent and difficult to look away from. All of them were making things that looked like exactly what they were. A large and proud and traditional Mara's knife was going to look like almost nothing until someone who knew what they were looking at picked it up. On the first night of heavy forging, she arrived at the forge station at the 18th hour of the Academy's daily cycle, when the classroom was empty and the overhead lights had dimmed to their low evening setting, and only the forge stations themselves cast any real light, orange and warm and shifting, like small contained fires, which was exactly what they were. She heated the Veth iron stock to the precise temperature she had identified in her tests, not a degree lower, which would leave the carbon distribution uneven, not a degree higher, which would begin to degrade the structure she was trying to build. She watched the color of the metal, which was something the ancient smiths of Earth had done long before any temperature measurement tool existed. Because metal tells you things with its color if you know how to read it, and Mara had spent 3 weeks learning to read Veth iron specifically. She folded it, not quickly, not with impatience. Fold after fold, working the metal back onto itself, each fold doubling the layers. At each pass, building the internal structure that would eventually make the edge hold. By the end of the first night, she had completed 9 folds, and her arms ached from the shoulder to the wrist, and the metal had not yet taken its final shape. She cleaned her station, put her tools in order, and went to her room and slept for 6 hours and came back. The second night was longer. She arrived earlier and stayed later. She was shaping now, taking the folded stock and drawing it out into the blade profile she had designed, using hammer and press and her own judgment about where the metal wanted to go, working with it rather than against it. Which was something the fabrication manual never mentioned, because it was not a thing that could be written in a manual. It was a thing you learned by doing it badly first, and then slowly less badly, and then eventually, well. By the end of the second night, the blade blank had its shape, rough still, edges not yet ground, no handle, no finish. But the geometry was there, the spine was there. And when she held it up under the forge light and sighted down the flat, she could see that it was straight and that the balance point sat exactly where she had calculated it would sit. She set it down carefully and did not smile, because smiling at it felt like rushing something that was not finished yet. The third night was when Sevi showed up. She came in at the 20th hour, which was late, even by forge student standards. Then she sat down on the bench near the window without announcing herself, and watched. She did not bring her own work. She did not pretend to be doing anything else. She just sat and watched Mara work, which was either an honest thing or a very confident thing. And Mara had begun to think that with Sevi, it was usually both. Mara was grinding the edge. Slow passes on the stone, consistent angle, consistent pressure. Not rushing, because rushing an edge was how you ruined everything you had built. The sound was steady and dry and rhythmic in the quiet room. "You have been here 3 nights in a row," Sevi said eventually. "Yes," Mara said. "My rest cycle requires 12 hours, Sevi said. "I cannot do what you are doing. None of us can. The Sketh could perhaps do 2 nights, but not 3. How do humans manage this?" Mara did not stop grinding. "We are not good at very many things," she said. "Yeah, but we are very difficult to stop." Sevi was quiet for a moment. "The blade is small," she said. and it was not quite a criticism, and it was more like a question wearing the shape of a statement. "Yes," Mara said. "Kreth An is going to say it is modest in scope," Sevi said. "I know," Mara said. "That is what he says when he means that something is not worth his full attention," Sevi said. "I know that too," Mara said. She lifted the blade and sighted down the edge in the forge light. The grind was even, consistent. That's exactly what she had planned. She set it back down and picked up the finer stone. "He will pick it up," she said. "How do you know?" Sevi asked. "Because he will not be able to help it," Mara said. Sevi watched her for another hour without speaking, and when she left, she did so quietly, and Mara heard the door close behind her and kept working. She did not notice on the third night that she was not entirely alone in the room in the way she had assumed. She did not look up at the high gallery that ran along the back wall of the forge classroom, the one that instructors used occasionally to observe students from above without disrupting the work. She did not see the figure standing there in the dim upper light, very still, arms folded. Gold eyes moving slowly over her workstation, the way someone's eyes move when they are watching something they did not expect to find interesting and have found interesting anyway. Kreth An stood there for nearly an hour. He had come to make a note in the class progress log, which he kept in the gallery office, and he had looked down through force of habit and seen her working, and he had not left. He watched her hands. He watched the angle she kept on the grindstone. He watched the way she held the blade up to check it, and the way she set it back down when she was not satisfied. He recognized the patience in it, which was not something he had expected from a human, and especially not from this particular human who was 19 years old and from a mining colony and had pushed his fabrication kit back across the table at him without a moment of hesitation. He said nothing. He did not announce himself. He simply stood there in the dark of the gallery and watched, and eventually he turned and walked away very quietly. And the only sound was the steady, dry rhythm of Mara's grindstone continuing in the warm orange light below. On the morning of the fourth day, with the presentation 2 weeks away, Mara completed the edge and began work on the grip. This was the part she had spent the most time designing, and for good reason. The grip was where everything that mattered most was going to live. She had tested 4 different wrap materials before settling on a synthetic polymer composite she had requested from the chemistry supply station, one that had a very specific property. Under increased pressure, it compresses slightly and then pushes back, distributing the force more evenly across the palm and fingers. Under normal grip pressure, it felt like a standard wrapped handle. Firm, secure, and unremarkable. But under the hard, desperate pressure of a hand that was frightened or exhausted or fighting against someone trying to take the blade away, it gripped back. It became more secure the harder circumstances became rather than less. It was a grip that rewarded the person holding it for needing it most. She wrapped it carefully, layer by layer. And when she was done, she held the finished knife in her hand and closed her fingers around it and applied pressure and felt the grip respond. And for the first time since she had started the project, she allowed herself a small, quiet, private moment of satisfaction. Then she set it down, covered it with a cloth, and went to get some sleep. Presentation day came on the last morning of the 6th week. The forge classroom had been rearranged overnight. The central work tables pushed back to make room for a long display table at the front, where each student would place their completed blade, and 4 chairs had been set behind a separate table for the senior faculty panel that would observe and assess alongside Kreth An 3 additional instructors from other departments, and all experienced and all carrying the particular stillness of people who had seen a great deal and were difficult to impress. The 12 students stood along the side wall with their blades wrapped or cased, waiting. There was a low, tense energy in the room that was not quite excitement and not quite fear, but something between them. Sevi stood near the window with all 4 arms close to her body, which Mara had learned was her way of containing nervous energy. The Sketh students clicked quietly to each other. The Auron had gone a very controlled gray, which meant focus Mara stood near the end of the row with her knife wrapped in a plain cloth. She was not nervous in the way the others were nervous. She was very still. And the particular stillness that had unsettled her classmates on the first day, and that none of them had entirely gotten used to Creth-On, stood at the front with his hands behind his back and called the first student forward. The presentations were impressive. The class had worked hard and the results showed. The Sketh warblades were long and authoritative, the channels down their centers ground clean and precise. The balance tested and certified, Sevi's four-armed ceremonial weapon was extraordinary, each of the four components fitting together into a whole that was both practical and deeply beautiful, the kind of thing that belonged in a museum and on a battlefield at the same time. The panel asked her several questions and she answered all of them well, and when she stepped back, she caught Mara's eye briefly, not with arrogance, just with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had done their best work. The Auron's blade was met with what Mara had learned to interpret as the panel's version of genuine admiration. Slower movements, longer pauses between questions, a kind of careful attention that meant they were looking at something they did not want to rush. Creth-On moved through each presentation methodically. Questions about material choice, about construction technique, about the rationale behind specific design decisions. He was exacting but not unkind, and it was clear in these moments that whatever else he was a genuinely skilled teacher when he chose to apply himself to the task. Then he called Mara's name. She walked to the display table and set down her cloth and unfolded it. The knife lay there under the bright presentation lights, clean and finished, its edge catching the light in a single thin line. Its grip wrapped in the dark composite material, it was 22 centimeters long, and it did not take up much space on the table, and it looked, in the context of everything that had come before it, extremely modest. A sound moved through the room, not quite a laugh, but the kind of collective breath that carries the same meaning. One of the panel members leaned slightly forward and then seemed to decide there was not much to lean toward and settled back. Creth-On looked at the blade from where he stood, several feet from the table. He did not step closer. He did not pick it up. He began speaking in the measured tone of someone who has already decided on a conclusion and is now assembling the words to deliver it with appropriate academic formality. Modest in scope, he said, and while the surface finish is acceptable, the cultural basis appears derivative. The folding pattern shows influence from pre-industrial earth technique, and which is historically interesting but does not constitute an original contribution. The blade is small, its application is unclear, and the folding pattern is 17 folds, Mara said. She said it the same way she had said everything since the first day, not loudly, not with any performance of confidence, just plainly, and with the assurance of someone who had done the work and knew what the work contained. The room went quiet in a different way than it had been quiet before. The base material is Veth iron, she continued, which has not been used for blade construction in this academy's history because it has been classified as too brittle. That classification is based on standard forge temperatures, at a temperature window of 38 degrees above standard. Now, with a 17-fold pattern at this specific reduction ratio, the carbon in Veth iron redistributes in a way that eliminates the brittleness entirely. The resulting edge is harder than any standard alloy in the supply archive and will not chip under multi-material impact. I have the test data written out if anyone wants to see it. She reached into her notebook and placed 3 pages of calculations on the table beside the knife. One of the panel members picked them up. The edge angle is 22 degrees, she said, which is 4 degrees steeper than the Academy's standard recommendation. The standard recommendation optimizes for single material cutting. At 22 degrees, the edge performs better across varied material resistance, which is what a blade encounters in actual use, rather than controlled testing. Creth-On had not moved. He was watching her now with both eyes fully on her, which was different from before. The grip, Mara said, and here she paused for just a moment. Not for effect, but because what came next required care. The grip material is a synthetic polymer composite with adaptive compression properties. Under standard grip pressure, it behaves like a normal handle. Under elevated grip pressure, the kind that occurs when a hand is tired or frightened, or when someone is trying to pull the blade away from you, the material compresses and rebounds in a way that increases contact friction across the palm and fingers. The harder the situation becomes, the more secure the hold. She looked at Creth-Anne directly. This blade was not designed for a general purpose, she said. It was designed for a specific person. Someone who sustained a restraint injury to the left forearm in a grip lock hold 31 years ago. Someone whose left hand has permanently reduced grip strength as a result. For that person. But every standard blade handle becomes a liability under pressure because the hand that needs the most support is the one most likely to fail. This grip addresses that directly. The reduced strength in the left hand becomes irrelevant because the handle compensates for it automatically. The room was absolutely still. Creth-Anne's face had not changed. It was the same controlled expression it always was. But his hands had moved very slightly from behind his back to his sides, and the left one had closed briefly into a fist and then opened again. "Master Creth-Anne," Mara said, and her voice was still even, still without performance. "You have a scar on your left forearm, 3 centimeters wide, irregular border. It is not a blade wound. The edges are wrong for that. It is a clamp-hold scar, which means you were restrained. The blade that was meant for you was held away from your own hand. You could not reach it." She stopped speaking and let the silence hold for a moment. "I built a blade so that cannot happen," she said. "The grip fights back." Nobody moved. The panel members were looking at Creth-Anne. The students along the wall were looking at Creth-Anne. Sevi's forearms had gone completely still. Creth-Anne stood where he was for 3 seconds. Which felt much longer than 3 seconds. Then he walked to the display table and picked up the knife. He held it in his right hand first, turned it, checked the balance, sighted down the edge the way a person does when they are assessing something seriously and not for show. Then he transferred it to his left hand, closed his left fingers around the grip, applied pressure, felt the grip respond, felt it push back, felt the resistance increase with his force in exactly the way Mara had described. He held it for a long moment, then he set it down carefully on the table. With considerably more care than he had used to pick it up. He turned to the panel. "I have no further questions for this student," he said, and the tone of it was not the tone of dismissal. It was the tone of a man who has just encountered the end of a long argument he had not known he was having. The final grades were posted 3 days after the presentation. A simple list, student name beside a score. I attached to the board outside the Forge classroom the way it always was at the end of a course module. Most students found their names and moved on. The scores were good across the board, the class had performed well, and there were other assignments to return to, and other courses that kept moving whether or not anyone stopped to stand in a corridor reading a posted list. Sevi was the one who found it first. She stood at the board for a moment, read it again, and then walked to the window at the end of the corridor and stood there very still, which was unusual for her because she was almost never still. When Mara arrived and looked at the board, she understood why. Her name was at the top of the list, which was not itself remarkable, but the number beside it was not a number that appeared on any previous version of that posted list. Not in any archived semester record she had seen. It was higher than any score the course had ever recorded below her name, in smaller text that Creth-Anne must have added himself because it was not standard grading format. Were 4 words, exceptional command of purpose. Mara looked at those 4 words for a moment. Then she took out her notebook and wrote the date and moved on. Word spread through the academy the way word always spreads in a place where people live and work in close quarters, not through any announcement, not through any official channel, just through the accumulated weight of people telling other people what they had heard, which grew slightly larger and slightly different with each telling, but kept its essential shape. A human student, first year, had scored highest in Creth Aun's course, not just this semester's course, the course in its entire history, and she had built a knife. The reaction to this was varied. Some faculty requested meetings with her to discuss her material research, particularly the Veth iron methodology, and which had apparently generated genuine academic interest in the materials science department. Two of them wanted to co-author a technical paper. Mara thanked them politely and said she would think about it. Some students, including several who had laughed on the first day when she answered Creth Aun's question, went quiet in a particular way when she walked past, not hostile, not warm, recalibrating, at the way a person recalibrates when the category they put someone in turns out to have been the wrong category, and they have not yet decided what the right one is. Sevi did not recalibrate. She walked up to Mara the morning after the grades were posted, in the corridor outside the forge room, with the directness that Mara had come to understand was simply how Sevi operated when she had made a decision. "Teach me the folding technique," Sevi said. Not quite a question, not quite a demand. Something in between that assumed the answer was yes, and was asking about the when and the where. Mara looked at her. "Teach me Dothrani grip fighting," she said. Sevi's forearms shifted in a way that Mara had learned meant she was pleased, though Sevi's face rarely showed it directly. "Done," Sevi said. They shook on it, Mara's one hand and one of Sevi's four, which was apparently the Dothrani formal version of agreement, and which Mara had looked up the night before because she had thought it might come up. It was, without either of them announcing it as such, the beginning of a friendship, the kind that starts in the space where respect lives before warmth has had time to grow into it, and which tends to be more durable because of that. Two senior faculty members stopped Mara in the main hall that week and asked if she would consider speaking to the incoming students at the next orientation, about human fabrication history, about the Veth iron methodology, about the cross-referencing approach she had used to adapt ancient technique to modern materials. The Academy had not had a human guest lecturer before, and they thought it might be useful for incoming students across species to see a broader range of approaches. Mara said she would think about it, which meant yes, and everyone who had been at the Academy long enough knew that was what it meant. On the fourth night after the grades were posted, Mara was in the forge room alone, not working, just sitting at her station with the knife in her hands, turning it slowly in the light the way a person turns something over when they are not quite ready to put it down. The forge stations were low and warm. The room was quiet, and she was not thinking about anything in particular, just sitting with the thing she had made the way you sometimes need to sit with something after it is finished before you can fully believe it is real. She heard the door open behind her. She did not turn around immediately, but she recognized the sound of the footsteps, long and deliberate and without waste. And then she was not entirely surprised when Creth Aun came and sat down across from her at the opposite station. He sat, not in the way a person sits when they are about to begin a formal meeting, but in the way a person sits when they have walked somewhere without being entirely sure why and have decided to stay now that they are there. They were quiet for a moment. The forge light moved between them, a warm and orange. "How did you know about the scar?" Creth Aun said. It was a genuine question, not accusatory, not defensive, the kind of question that can only be asked by someone who has stopped being certain about what they were certain about. The medical record was still attached to the competition archive, Mara said. It had not been sealed. I think no one thought to seal it when the records were digitized. The injury description was specific. Creth Aun was quiet for a moment. "And you decided to build for it." "You told me on the first day what a blade was," Mara said. "You said it was a spiritual extension of the warrior's lineage. I thought if I was going to make a blade, I should actually know the warrior first. So I looked. Creth-An turned the thought over the way she was turning the knife. Slowly, without hurry. You spent 6 weeks on a blade for a person who had already decided you were not worth teaching, he said. I was not building it for you to like me, Mara said. I was building it because the problem was real. Your left hand has been compensating for 31 years, and no blade you have ever held has helped it. That is a solvable problem. I solved it. Creth-An looked at the knife in her hands. May I? He said. She handed it to him. He took it in his left hand again. I closed his fingers, felt the grip respond, felt it steady him in the way that nothing had steadied that hand in a very long time. He held it for a while without speaking. 4,000 years of blade tradition, he said finally. And there was something different in his voice now. Something that was not quite humility, but was close to it. The thing that lives just next to humility in a person who has been very certain for a very long time. And you found a problem we never looked for. Mara was quiet for a moment. We have only been making blades for about 5,000 years, she said. We had to be efficient about it. We did not have time to assume we had covered everything. Creth-An looked at her, and for the first time since she had walked into his classroom on the first day of the semester, and the flat expression was gone. What replaced it was not warm exactly, not the warmth of someone who has changed their mind easily, but something more durable than warmth, the look of a teacher who has found, against his own expectations, a student worth the name. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost, which for Creth-An, Mara would later learn, was the same thing. He set the knife down between them on the workbench. Neither of them moved to pick it up. They sat in the warm forge light in the quiet room, and outside the wide dark pressed against the windows. And somewhere in the academy's lower levels, the forges burned on as they always did, patient and constant and never cold. The academy would record the semester's results in its official archive the following week. Grade distributions, material innovations, the faculty notes, all of it logged and filed in the way that institutions log and file things, carefully and without feeling. But the note that would be added to the course record for advanced weapons fabrication in a line that future students would read and argue about and not entirely understand until they had been in the room long enough to feel what the room had felt that day, was brief and precise and written in Creth-An's own hand. It was, the record noted, not the first time in the course's history that a student had been asked to make a blade and had used it to cut through something far harder than any metal. 4,000 years of certainty and the long silence that had lived inside it